It was supposed to be just another ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the quiet suburban neighborhood of Brookhaven. The sun was shining through the large windows of the Whitmore mansion, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Margaret. Whitmore had left early that morning for her weekly charity luncheon at the country club, wearing her favorite pearl necklace and designer dress. She was the kind of woman who believed appearances mattered above everything else. At home, 3-year-old Tommy was having one of those days that every parent knows too well. He had been cranky since breakfast, refusing to eat his cereal and throwing his toys around the playroom. Maria Santos, the family's housekeeper for the past 5 years, watched him with the patience that only comes from genuine care and years of experience with children. Maria had started working for the Whitmore family when Tommy was just 6 months old. She had watched him take his first steps, heard his first words, and comforted him through countless tears and tantrums. To Tommy, Maria wasn't just the woman who cleaned his house and prepared his meals. She was the warm presence who sang him Spanish lullabies when he couldn't sleep, who made funny faces to stop his crying, and who always had time for one more story or game. That afternoon, while Margaret was discussing charitable donations over expensive wine, Tommy was busy being a typical 3-year-old. He had discovered that he could push one of the dining room chairs across the hardwood floor, creating a loud scraping sound that made him giggle with delight. Maria was in the kitchen preparing ingredients for dinner when she heard the familiar sound of furniture being moved around. She peeked around the corner and saw Tommy pushing the heavy wooden chair with all his might, his little face red with effort and concentration. His tongue was sticking out slightly, the way children do when they're focusing really hard on something. Maria smiled to herself, remembering how her own nephew used to do the same thing at that age. For a moment, she considered stopping him, but Tommy seemed so proud of his accomplishment. He looked up at her with those bright blue eyes and grinned widely, showing off his tiny white teeth. "Look, Mama Maria, I'm strong," he announced, using the name he had called her since he first learned to talk. Maria's heart melted as it did every time he called her that. She knew Margaret didn't approve of the nickname, but Tommy had started using it naturally, and Maria never had the heart to correct him. "Yes, you are very strong, little one," she replied in her gentle voice, tinged with just a hint of her El Salvadoran accent. Tommy decided he wanted to climb onto the chair he had just moved. In his 3-year-old mind, it seemed like the perfect plan. He could reach higher things, maybe even touch the pretty flowers in the tall vase on the side table. Maria was washing lettuce at the kitchen sink, keeping one ear tuned to Tommy's activities in the next room. What happened next took only seconds, but those seconds would change everything for this family. Tommy grabbed the seat of the chair and tried to pull himself up, but the chair was heavier than he expected, and it wasn't positioned quite right. As he put his weight on it, the chair tilted backward. Tommy, still holding on, went backward with it. The sound of the crash echoed through the house. First, there was the loud thud of Tommy's small body hitting the floor, followed immediately by his piercing scream of pain and fear. Then came the sound Maria dreaded most: silence. For just a moment, Tommy was so shocked and hurt that he couldn't even cry. Maria dropped the lettuce and ran faster than she had ever run in her life. She found Tommy lying on his back next to the overturned chair, his eyes wide with shock and pain. A small bump was already forming on the back of his head where it had hit the edge of the heavy wooden coffee table. "Oh, my sweet boy," Maria whispered, her heart racing with worry. She knelt down beside him, her experienced hands gently checking for any serious injuries. She had raised 4 children of her own back in El Salvador before coming to America, and she knew how to assess whether a child was seriously hurt or just scared. Tommy's cries filled the room now, loud and heartbreaking. Maria carefully touched the bump on his head, checking for any signs of serious injury. It was swollen but not bleeding, which was a good sign. She looked into his eyes, making sure his pupils looked normal and that he seemed alert and responsive. "Shh, shh, it's okay, little one," she murmured, her voice calm and soothing despite her own fear. "Mama Maria is here. You're going to be okay." She gently placed her hand on his forehead, checking for fever and offering comfort through her touch. Tommy reached up toward her with his little arms, wanting to be held and comforted. Maria carefully lifted him, cradling him against her chest while continuing to examine the bump on his head. She had been through this exact situation with her own children and knew that most head bumps in toddlers, while scary, were not usually serious. She was so focused on caring for Tommy that she didn't hear the front door open. She didn't hear the click of expensive heels on the marble floor. She was completely absorbed in making sure the little boy she loved was okay. Margaret had returned early from her luncheon because one of the other women had made a comment that irritated her. Something about how lucky she was to have such dedicated help, delivered in a tone that Margaret felt was slightly mocking. She had left in a huff, driving home faster than usual, still fuming about the perceived slight. She walked into her house expecting the usual peaceful quiet of a well-run household. Instead, she heard crying. Not just any crying, but her son's crying. And it sounded like he was in pain. Margaret rushed toward the sound, her heels clicking rapidly on the floor. When she turned the corner into the living room, the scene that greeted her sent her into an immediate panic. Her precious son was crying in the arms of the housekeeper. There was an overturned chair and Tommy's hair looked messy. In Margaret's mind, which was already clouded by the stress of the day and her own deep-seated anxieties about her son's safety, the scene looked all wrong. She didn't see a caring woman comforting a hurt child. She didn't notice the obvious signs that there had been an accident. She didn't pause to ask what had happened or to assess the situation calmly. All Margaret saw was her son in distress, and someone else holding him. Someone who, in her mind, had no business being so intimate with her child. "What did you do to him?" Margaret's voice was sharp and accusing as she strode across the room. Maria looked up, startled by the sudden appearance and the angry tone. "Mrs. Whitmore, he fell and hit his head. I was just checking to make sure he's okay. The bump doesn't look too serious, but maybe we should get your hands off my son." Margaret's voice rose to a near shout. Maria was confused and hurt by the hostility in Margaret's voice, but she gently transferred Tommy to his mother's arms. "He was climbing on the chair and it tipped over. I think he's more scared than hurt. But the bump should be watched for." That's when it happened. Margaret's hand flew through the air and connected with Maria's cheek with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the walls. The slap was hard enough to leave a red mark immediately. Maria stumbled backward, her hand flying to her face, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. In 5 years of working for this family, Margaret had never so much as raised her voice to her. "How dare you touch my child?" Margaret screamed, her face flushed with anger. "I trusted you in my home, and this is what happens when I leave?" Tommy, who had been calming down in his mother's arms, started crying again, louder this time. The angry voices and tension in the room frightened him more than his fall had. Maria stood there, her cheeks stinging, trying to process what had just happened. She had been slapped. slapped for helping a child she loved, a child she had cared for since he was a baby. "Mrs. Whitmore, please let me explain." Maria's voice was quiet, shaky with emotion. "There's nothing to explain." Margaret cut her off. "Pack your things and get out of my house, now." "But Tommy needs—" "Don't you dare tell me what my son needs!" Margaret's voice was getting higher and more hysterical. "You're fired, and if you're not out of here in 10 minutes, I'm calling the police." Tommy was reaching toward Maria now, his little arms stretched out, crying, "Mama Maria, Mama Maria." He didn't understand why everyone was yelling, why his beloved caregiver looked so sad, or why his mother seemed so angry. Maria's heart broke as she looked at the little boy she had helped raise. She wanted to comfort him one last time, to explain that she had to go away, but Margaret turned her body to block Maria's view of Tommy. With tears streaming down her face, Maria walked slowly toward the door. Her legs felt shaky, and her cheeks still burned from the slap. She had to pack her few personal belongings and leave the only stable job she had known in America. As she gathered her things from the small room where she kept her purse and coat, Maria could hear Tommy still crying and calling for her. Each sob felt like a knife in her heart. She was not just losing a job, she was losing a little boy who had become like her own grandchild. Margaret stood in the living room holding her son, but she felt no satisfaction in what she had done. Something nagged at her, a small voice in the back of her mind suggesting that perhaps she had acted too quickly, too harshly. But her pride wouldn't let her consider that she might have been wrong. Tommy continued to cry, and nothing. Margaret. Dad seemed to comfort him. He kept looking toward the door where Maria had disappeared, reaching out with his little hands and repeating "Mama Maria" over and over again. When Maria finally left through the back door, closing it quietly behind her, Tommy's cries became even more desperate. He had never been separated from Maria like this before, and he couldn't understand why she wasn't coming back to make everything better. Margaret found herself alone with her son, trying to soothe him, but nothing worked. The house felt different. Somehow, emptier, despite the fact that it was filled with expensive furniture and beautiful decorations. As the afternoon wore on and Tommy refused to calm down, Margaret began to feel the first tiny seeds of doubt about what had happened. But she pushed those thoughts away, telling herself that she had protected her son, that she had done what any good mother would do. She had no idea that in a few hours, when her husband came home and started asking questions, the truth would come out in a way that would shake the very foundation of everything she believed about herself. David Whitmore pulled into his driveway at exactly 6:30 that evening, just like he did every weekday. As a partner at one of Atlanta's most prestigious law firms, he was used to long days and demanding clients. But coming home to his family was always the best part of his day. He loved hearing about Tommy's adventures and seeing his son's face light up when Daddy walked through the door. Tonight felt different the moment he stepped inside. Usually, Tommy would come running to greet him, his little feet pattering across the marble floor, arms stretched wide for a hug. Instead, David heard crying coming from upstairs. Not the normal fussy crying of a tired toddler, but the heartbroken sobbing that meant something was really wrong. Margaret appeared at the top of the staircase looking frazzled and exhausted. Her perfectly styled hair was messy, and there were stress lines around her eyes that David hadn't seen in a long time. "Thank goodness you're home," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Tommy has been impossible all afternoon. I don't know what's gotten into him." David loosened his tie and climbed the stairs 2 at a time. "What happened? Is he sick?" No, he's just being difficult. He won't stop crying for Maria, and I've tried everything. Margaret's voice carried an edge that David couldn't quite identify. Where is Maria? David asked, noticing the unusual quiet in the house. Normally, he could hear Maria humming in the kitchen or see the warm glow of lights from the family areas where she would be preparing dinner. Margaret hesitated for just a moment. I had to let her go today. She was inappropriate with Tommy. David stopped walking. Inappropriate? What do you mean? I came home and found her with her hands all over him. He was crying, and she was touching him in ways that made me uncomfortable. I couldn't risk having someone like that around our son. Something in Margaret's explanation didn't sit right with David. He had watched Maria with Tommy countless times over the past 5 years. She was gentle, caring, and professional. Tommy adored her, and David had never seen anything that would suggest inappropriate behavior. They reached Tommy's bedroom, where their son was curled up in his race car bed, clutching his favorite stuffed elephant. His face was red and blotchy from crying, and when he saw his father, the tears started fresh. "Daddy!" Tommy reached up with both arms. "Want Mama Maria? Where Mama Maria go?" David scooped up his son, feeling the little body shake with sobs. "Hey, buddy, what's wrong? Tell Daddy what happened." "Head hurt," Tommy said between hiccups. "Fall down. Mama Maria make better, but Mama send away." David felt Tommy's head gently and found a small bump on the back. "You fell down? How did you—" "Fall. Chair tip over," Tommy explained in his simple 3-year-old way. "Boom! Head hurt bad. Mama Maria kiss better." David looked at Margaret, who was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed. Her expression was defensive, almost challenging. "He fell and hit his head?" David asked carefully. "Yes, but that's not the point," Margaret replied quickly. "The point is how she was touching him when I found them. It wasn't appropriate." David spent the next hour trying to comfort Tommy, but nothing worked. The little boy kept asking for Maria, kept saying his head hurt, and kept reaching toward the door as if expecting her to walk in at any moment. Finally, Tommy exhausted himself and fell into a fitful sleep. Downstairs, David tried to get more details from Margaret about what had happened, but her story seemed to change slightly each time she told it. First, she said Maria was holding Tommy inappropriately. Then she said Maria had been careless and let Tommy get hurt. When David asked specific questions about what exactly Maria had been doing, Margaret became evasive. "I don't want to talk about it anymore," Margaret finally said. "I made a decision to protect our son, and I stand by it. Maria is gone, and that's final." But David couldn't let it go. Something felt very wrong about the whole situation. He had built his career on asking the right questions and getting to the truth. And right now, nothing about Margaret's story made sense. After Margaret went upstairs to take a bath, David sat in his home office thinking. He remembered installing the security camera system 2 years ago after there had been some break-ins in the neighborhood. The cameras covered most of the main areas of the house, including the living room where Margaret said the incident had occurred. David had never needed to look at the footage before. The system automatically saved everything for 30 days before recording over it. He logged into the security app on his computer and selected today's date. His hands were shaking slightly as he fast-forwarded through the day's recordings. He saw Margaret leaving for her luncheon around 11 in the morning, dressed in her usual elegant style. He saw Maria going about her normal routine, cleaning and organizing. Then he found the time stamp that mattered. Just after 2 in the afternoon, he saw Tommy pushing a dining room chair across the living room floor. Maria was in the background, visible through the kitchen doorway, washing dishes at the sink. David watched as Tommy tried to climb onto the chair. He could see what was going to happen before it did. The chair tilted backward, and Tommy fell, his head striking the edge of the coffee table. What David saw next made his stomach drop. Maria ran from the kitchen faster than he had ever seen her move. She dropped to her knees beside Tommy, her face full of concern and love. David could see her hands moving gently over Tommy's head, checking for injuries in exactly the way any experienced caregiver would do. She lifted Tommy carefully, holding him close while examining the bump on his head. Her body language showed nothing but appropriate concern and professional care. She was comforting a hurt child, exactly as she should have been doing. David fast-forwarded to the moment Margaret came home. He watched his wife enter the living room and saw the exact moment she spotted Maria holding Tommy. But from this angle, David could see what Margaret either missed or chose to ignore. The overturned chair was clearly visible. Tommy's distressed state was obvious. Maria's careful, gentle examination of his injury was completely appropriate. There was nothing inappropriate about her actions. Nothing at all. David watched in growing horror as Margaret confronted Maria. He couldn't hear the words through the security footage, but he could see the body language. He saw Margaret's hand strike Maria's face. He saw Maria stumble backward, her hand flying to her cheek in shock and pain. Most heartbreaking of all, he saw Tommy reaching for Maria as Margaret pulled him away. The little boy clearly wanted comfort from the woman who had cared for him since he was a baby, the woman who had just helped him when he was hurt and scared. David sat back in his chair, feeling sick to his stomach. Maria had been fired, humiliated, and physically assaulted for doing exactly what any caring person would do when a child was injured. Margaret had seen a scene of compassion and somehow twisted it into something sinister in her mind. But why? Why would Margaret react so strongly to something so innocent? David thought back over the past few months, trying to remember if there had been signs of this kind of thinking before. He recalled small comments Margaret had made about Maria being too familiar with Tommy. He remembered Margaret's discomfort when Tommy called Maria Mama Maria, though David had always thought it was sweet. There had been the incident at the country club when one of Margaret's friends had praised Maria's dedication to their family. Margaret had seemed embarrassed rather than proud. And there were the subtle ways Margaret had started limiting Maria's interactions with Tommy, suggesting that the housekeeper should focus more on cleaning and less on childcare. David realized, with growing clarity, that his wife's reaction hadn't been about protecting Tommy at all. It had been about something else entirely, something that made him deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge. He thought about Maria, probably at home now, trying to explain to her family why she had suddenly lost her job. He knew she sent most of her salary back to El Salvador to help support her elderly mother's medical care. This job wasn't just income. For Maria, it was a lifeline for her entire family. David also thought about Tommy, sleeping fitfully upstairs, calling out for the woman who had been like a grandmother to him. The woman who knew exactly how he liked his sandwiches cut, who could calm his fears during thunderstorms, who had taught him his first words in Spanish. The security footage had shown David the truth, but it had also revealed something about his wife that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Margaret had destroyed an innocent woman's life and traumatized their son, all because of assumptions and prejudices that David was only now beginning to understand. As he sat in his office, The weight of what he had discovered settled on his shoulders. He had to decide what to do with this information. He had to figure out how to fix what Margaret had broken. And he had to find a way to help his son, who was suffering because the adults in his life had failed him. David knew that. Confronting Margaret wouldn't be easy. She was proud and stubborn, and admitting she had been wrong would be incredibly difficult for her. But the truth was there in black and white, recorded by the very security system he had installed to protect his family. Tomorrow, he would have to find Maria and try to make things right. Tonight, he had to figure out how to tell his wife that she had made a terrible, terrible mistake, and he had to prepare himself for the possibility that this revelation might change their marriage forever. The house felt different now, emptier and sadder. David could hear Tommy stirring upstairs, probably having another bad dream. Without Maria's comforting presence, even the familiar sounds of home seemed hollow and wrong. David closed the laptop and sat in the dark, wondering how he had missed the signs of something so troubling in his own wife. And he wondered if it was possible to rebuild trust and understanding after such a devastating betrayal of everything their family was supposed to represent. David barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the security footage playing over and over again. Maria's shocked face after the slap. Tommy reaching for her as Margaret pulled him away. The overturned chair that told the real story of what had happened. By morning, David had made his decision. He couldn't let this injustice stand. But first, he needed to talk to Margaret. He found her in the kitchen, making coffee with sharp, angry movements. She was already dressed for the day in another expensive outfit, her makeup perfect despite the stress of the previous evening. Tommy sat at the breakfast table, pushing his cereal around in his bowl without eating. "Mama Maria?" Tommy asked hopefully, looking toward the kitchen door where Maria usually appeared with his favorite fruit cut into fun shapes. "Stop asking for her," Margaret snapped. "She's not coming back." Tommy's lower lip started to tremble, and David felt his heart break a little more. His son didn't understand why the woman who had loved and cared for him was suddenly gone. "Margaret, we need to talk," David said quietly. "Tommy, why don't you go play in the living room for a few minutes?" "But I want Mama Maria," Tommy said, tears starting to form in his eyes. "I know, buddy. Just give Mommy and Daddy a few minutes to talk, okay?" After Tommy reluctantly left the kitchen, David turned to face his wife. "I watched the security footage from yesterday." Margaret's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. "What?" "The cameras, Margaret. I saw everything that really happened." For a moment, Margaret said nothing. Then she set down her cup and lifted her chin defiantly. "I don't know what you think you saw, but I was there. I saw her with her hands all over Tommy." She was checking his injuries after he fell and hit his head. David said calmly, "Just like any caring person would do. Just like you or I would do." "That's not the point," Margaret said, her voice getting higher. She was too familiar with him, too comfortable. "Too comfortable?" David repeated. "Margaret, she's been taking care of Tommy since he was 6 months old. Of course she's comfortable with him. That's what we wanted when we hired her." Margaret turned away, busying herself with cleaning the already spotless counter. "You don't understand. People like her, they get ideas. They forget their place." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. "People like her? What does that mean?" "You know what I mean," Margaret said without turning around. "No, I don't." "Explain it to me." Margaret spun around, her face flushed with frustration. She's the help, David. She's not his mother. She's not family. But she acts like she is, and Tommy treats her like she is. And it's not appropriate. Not appropriate because she cares about our son? Not appropriate because she's... Margaret struggled to find words that wouldn't sound as bad as what she was thinking. Because she doesn't know her boundaries. David studied his wife's face, seeing things he had been blind to for years. This isn't about boundaries, is it? This is about the fact that Maria is from El Salvador. This is about the color of her skin. Don't be ridiculous, Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it ridiculous? Because I'm thinking back to all the little comments you've made over the years, how uncomfortable you got when Tommy started calling her Mama Maria. How you always introduced her as just the housekeeper when your friends came over, even though she's been more like a nanny. Margaret's face was getting redder. I don't have to listen to this. I protected our son from an inappropriate situation, and I won't apologize for that. You slapped an innocent woman, Margaret. You fired her for helping our injured child, and you traumatized Tommy in the process. She was getting too close to him, Margaret insisted, too attached. It wasn't healthy. For who? For Tommy, who clearly loves her? Or for you because you couldn't stand that your son had formed a bond with someone you consider beneath us? The words hung in the air between them. Margaret's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. David had never spoken to her this directly about something so uncomfortable. You don't understand, Margaret finally whispered. My friends at the club, they talk. They say things about families where the help gets too involved with the children. They say it's not good for the children's development, that it confuses them about social boundaries. Social boundaries? David's voice was getting louder despite his efforts to stay calm. Maria has been nothing but professional and loving with our son. She's probably the most honest, hard-working person I know. And you fired her because your country club friends think she's getting above her station? Margaret wrapped her arms around herself defensively. You weren't there. You didn't see how she was with him. I did see, Margaret. I saw the security footage. I saw a woman who loves our son taking care of him when he was hurt. I saw her doing exactly what any decent person would do. David pulled out his phone and showed Margaret a photo. It was a picture from Tommy's second birthday party, showing Maria helping him blow out his candles. Tommy's face was bright with joy, and Maria was smiling down at him with obvious affection. Look at this picture, David said. Look at how happy Tommy is. Look at how much love is in this moment. And tell me that what you did yesterday was about protecting him. Margaret glanced at the photo and quickly looked away. That's different. How is it different? Because... Margaret struggled to find an explanation that wouldn't reveal the ugly truth about her feelings. Because I'm his mother. I know what's best for him. Do you? Because right now Tommy is miserable. He barely ate dinner last night, he cried himself to sleep, and this morning he won't touch his breakfast. The person who knows how to comfort him, who knows his routines and his fears and his favorite things, is gone. Because of you. David walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard where Tommy used to play with Maria. She would push him on the swing set and help him collect leaves and bugs. Simple moments that had meant the world to a little boy. Do you know why Maria needed this job so badly? David asked, still looking out the window. Margaret didn't answer. Her mother is 73 years old and has diabetes. Maria sends most of her salary home to pay for her mother's medication and doctor visits. This job wasn't just income for her, Margaret. It was her family's lifeline. David turned back to face his wife. And do you know what else? Maria has 4 children of her own back in El Salvador. She came here to work so she could give them a better life. She's been separated from her own children for 5 years so she could take care of ours. Margaret's face had gone pale. I didn't know that. You never asked. In 5 years, you never once asked Maria about her family, her life, her dreams. To you, she was just the help. That's not true, Margaret protested weakly. Isn't it? When was the last time you had a real conversation with Maria? When did you last ask her how she was doing? Or if she needed anything? Or how her family was? Margaret opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again. She couldn't remember a single meaningful conversation with Maria beyond instructions about housework and childcare. You know what the worst part is? David continued. Tommy loves her, really loves her, and she loves him back. In a world where so many children don't have enough love and attention, our son was blessed to have an extra person who cared about him deeply. And you threw that away because of your prejudices. I'm not prejudiced, Margaret said, but her voice was barely a whisper. Then what would you call it? You saw a Latina woman touching your white son, and you immediately assumed something inappropriate was happening. You didn't ask questions. You didn't assess the situation. You just reacted based on your fears and assumptions about who she is and what she might do. David sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly feeling exhausted. Margaret, I love you. We've been married for 8 years and we've built a life together. But I need you to be honest with me. What really scared you yesterday? Margaret remained standing by the counter, her arms still wrapped around herself. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice so quiet David had to strain to hear her, she said, I was scared that he loved her more than me. The admission hung in the air between them. David felt his anger begin to shift into something that might have been understanding, though the hurt was still raw. Margaret. He calls her Mama Maria, Margaret continued, her voice breaking slightly. He runs to her when he's hurt. He laughs at her stories. He eats food for her that he won't eat for me. And I felt like I was losing him. So you fired the woman who was helping you raise him? I know it doesn't make sense, Margaret said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. But when I saw her holding him, comforting him, being everything a mother should be, I felt threatened and scared and angry. David stood up and walked over to his wife. Despite his disappointment and anger, he could see that she was genuinely struggling with feelings she didn't understand. Margaret, love isn't a competition. Tommy loving Maria doesn't mean he loves you less. Children have room in their hearts for lots of people. But she's not supposed to be his mother, Margaret whispered. She's not trying to be his mother. She's just loving him the way anyone who spends time with a child should love them, the way a grandmother would, or an aunt, or a teacher. Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. I've ruined everything, haven't I? David looked at his wife, seeing both the woman he had fallen in love with and a person whose fears had led her to do something terrible. Maybe, but maybe it's not too late to fix it. From the living room came the sound of Tommy crying again, calling out for Mama Maria. The sound cut through both of them like a knife. We need to find Maria, David said. We need to apologize and ask her to come back. What if she won't? Margaret asked, fear evident in her voice. Then we'll have to live with the consequences of what we've done. But we have to try, for Tommy's sake and for our own. David looked at his wife, hoping to see some sign that she truly understood the weight of what had happened. But first, you need to understand something, Margaret. This can't ever happen again. If Maria comes back, you need to treat her with the respect and dignity she deserves, not as the help, but as a valuable member of our family's life. Margaret nodded, though David could see the struggle in her eyes. Years of ingrained attitudes wouldn't change overnight. But maybe, just maybe, this crisis could be the beginning of something better for all of them. Finding Maria wasn't easy. David had never needed her personal contact information before because she had always just been there, part of the daily routine of their household. He realized with shame that in 5 years, he had never even asked where she lived. After calling the agency that had originally referred Maria to them, David learned that she had been staying with her sister's family in a small apartment across town. The agency director, Mrs. Rodriguez, was initially reluctant to give out Maria's address. "Mr. Whitmore," Mrs. Rodriguez said over the phone, her voice cool and professional, "Maria called me yesterday very upset. She said she was fired without cause and that Mrs. Whitmore struck her. Frankly, I'm not sure Maria wants to speak with your family right now." David felt his stomach clench with guilt. "Mrs. Rodriguez, there was a terrible misunderstanding. I have security footage that proves Maria did nothing wrong. We need to make this right." There was a long pause. "I've known Maria for 7 years. Mr. Whitmore, she's one of the most honest, caring people I've ever worked with. If she says something happened, I believe her." "So do I," David said quietly. "That's why I need to find her and apologize." Another pause. Then Mrs. Rodriguez gave him an address on the other side of Atlanta. David spent the rest of Wednesday morning driving through unfamiliar neighborhoods, looking for the small apartment complex where Maria was staying. The contrast between this area and his own wealthy suburb was stark. The buildings were older, the streets narrower, and many of the signs were in Spanish. When he finally found the right address, David sat in his car for several minutes, trying to figure out what he would say. How do you apologize for something so devastating? How do you ask someone to forgive the unforgivable? The apartment complex was a modest 2-story building with peeling paint and small balconies. David climbed the stairs to apartment 2B and knocked. Softly on the door, a young woman answered, looking suspicious when she saw David's expensive suit and nervous expression. "Yes? I'm looking for Maria Santos. I'm David Whitmore, her former employer. I need to speak with her about what happened." The woman's expression hardened. "Maria doesn't want to see you people. You hurt her enough." "Please," David said. "I know my wife made a terrible mistake. I have proof that Maria did nothing wrong. I just want to apologize and ask her to come back." "Come back?" The woman laughed bitterly. "After what your wife did to her? Maria was crying all night. She's been taking care of your family for 5 years, and this is how you treat her?" David felt shame burning in his chest. "I know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but please let me talk." To her. "Let me try to make this right." The woman studied his face for a moment, then called over her shoulder in Spanish. David heard a familiar voice respond, and his heart jumped. Maria was here. After a brief conversation in Spanish, the door opened wider. Maria appeared, looking smaller and more fragile than David had ever seen her. Her face was drawn with exhaustion, and there was still a faint mark on her cheek where Margaret had slapped her. "Mr. Whitmore," Maria said quietly, her voice formal and distant. This wasn't the warm, caring woman who had been part of their family for years. This was someone who had been hurt and betrayed. "Maria, I'm so sorry," David began, his voice thick with emotion. "I watched the security footage. I saw what really happened. You were taking care of Tommy after he fell. You did everything right." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. "My wife was wrong," David continued. "Completely wrong. She let her fears and prejudices cloud her judgment, and she hurt you terribly. There's no excuse for what she did." "Tommy," Maria said softly. "How is Tommy?" David's heart broke a little more. Even after being fired and humiliated, Maria's first concern was still for the little boy she loved. "He's heartbroken. He won't eat, won't sleep well. He keeps asking for you." A tear rolled down Maria's cheek. "I miss him so much." "He misses you too. We all do. The house feels empty without you." David reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Maria, I want you to come back. I'm offering you a significant raise, paid vacation time, and health insurance. And I promise you that nothing like this will ever happen again." Maria looked at the envelope, but didn't take it. "Mr. Whitmore, you are a good man, but your wife, she looked at me like I was something dirty, like I was dangerous to Tommy. How can I come back to a house where I'm not trusted?" "Because we need you," David said simply. "Tommy needs you. And maybe Margaret needs to learn from you. She needs to see that her fears were wrong." "I don't want to be a lesson for Mrs. Whitmore," Maria said, her voice gaining strength. "I don't want to prove that I'm good enough. I want to be respected for who I am." David nodded. "You're right. You deserve respect not just from me, but from Margaret, too. I've had a long talk with her, and she knows she was wrong. She wants to apologize to you herself." Maria's sister, who had been listening from the doorway, said something sharp in Spanish. David didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. She thought Maria should stay far away from the Whitmore family. "My sister thinks I should find a new job," Maria said. "She thinks your family will never change." "She might." "Be right," David admitted. "I can't promise that Margaret will change overnight, but I can promise that I'll never let something like this happen again. And I hope, that this might be the wake-up call Margaret needed." Maria was quiet for a long moment, thinking. David could see the conflict in her face. She loved Tommy, that was clear, but she had been deeply wounded. "I need to think about it," Maria finally said. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Here's my direct number." David handed her a business card. "Call me any time, day or night." As David drove home, he felt a small spark of hope. Maria hadn't said no. That was something. But when he got home, he found Margaret in full crisis mode. Tommy had refused his lunch and was sitting in the middle of the living room, crying inconsolably. "I don't know what to do," Margaret said, her own eyes red from crying. "He won't listen to me. He just keeps asking for Maria." David knelt down beside his son. "Hey, buddy, Daddy went to see Mama Maria today." Tommy's crying stopped immediately. "Mama Maria come home?" "Maybe, Tommy. Daddy asked her to come back. But we hurt her feelings, so she needs time to think about it." "I sorry," Tommy said in his little voice. "I be good boy." "You are a good boy," David assured him. "This isn't your fault. The grown-ups made a mistake." That evening, after Tommy finally fell asleep, David and Margaret sat in their living room talking. Really talking, perhaps for the first time in years. "I've been thinking about what you said this morning," Margaret began. "About me never asking Maria about her life. You're right. I never saw her as a real person with her own family and struggles. She was just there." David nodded but didn't interrupt. "I was raised to think there were clear lines between us and them," Margaret continued. "The people who serve and the people who are served. My mother always said it was important to be kind but not too familiar, to keep proper boundaries." "And what do you think now?" David asked. Margaret looked around their beautiful home, with its expensive furniture and perfect decorations. "I think I've been living in a bubble where I never had to question anything I was taught or really see the people around me as equals. It's not easy to change the way you've always thought," David said gently. "No, it's not. But watching Tommy suffer these past few days, seeing how much he loves Maria and how much she obviously loves him, I can't deny that anymore." 2 days later, Maria called David's number. Her voice was quiet but determined. When she spoke, "Mr. Whitmore, I've decided to come back, but I have conditions." "Name them," David said immediately. "I want a written contract that explains my job duties and protects me from being fired without cause. I want Mrs. Whitmore to apologize to me properly, not just a quick sorry. And I want to be treated with respect, as a valued part of your household, not just as the help." "Done," David said. "All of it. When can you start?" "Monday morning." "But, Mr. Whitmore, if anything like this ever happens again, I won't give you a second chance." "I understand completely." When Maria walked through the front door on Monday morning, Tommy's shriek of joy could probably be heard 3 houses away. He ran to her so fast he almost knocked himself over, throwing his little arms around her legs and refusing to let go. "Mama Maria! Mama Maria! You come back!" Maria knelt down and hugged him properly, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, little one. I came back." Margaret appeared in the doorway, looking nervous and ashamed. She approached slowly, as if afraid. "Maria might run away." "Maria," Margaret said, her voice shaky, "I owe you a sincere apology. What I did was wrong, completely wrong. I let my fears and prejudices make me see things that weren't there. I hurt you terribly, and I'm deeply sorry." Maria stood up, still holding Tommy's hand. She looked Margaret in the eye for a long moment. "Mrs. Whitmore, I accept your apology, but I need you to understand something. I love Tommy like he was my own grandson. I would never do anything to hurt him. My job is to take care of your family, and I take that job seriously." "I know that now," Margaret said, "and I want you to know that things will be different. I want to learn about your family, your life. I want to treat you the way you deserve to be treated. It wasn't perfect immediately. Change never is." Margaret had to catch herself several times when old attitudes tried to surface. But slowly, day by day, things got better. Margaret started asking Maria about her mother's health and her children back home. She learned that Maria's oldest daughter was studying to be a nurse and that her youngest son loved soccer. She discovered that Maria made the most amazing pupusas and asked for the recipe. Most importantly, Margaret began to see how Tommy flourished with Maria back in his life. His laughter returned. His appetite came back. He started sleeping through the night again. One evening, about a month after Maria's return, Margaret found herself watching as Maria helped Tommy with a puzzle. The two of them were sitting on the floor, heads bent together, completely absorbed in finding the right pieces. "Look, Mama Maria, I found the corner," Tommy exclaimed. "You're so smart, little one. Maria said, her face glowing with pride. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. Instead of jealousy or resentment, she felt grateful. Grateful that her son had someone who loved him so completely. Grateful that there was another person in the world who wanted the best for Tommy. "Maria," Margaret said softly. Both Maria and Tommy looked up. "Thank you," Margaret said simply, "for loving him, for forgiving us another chance." Maria smiled, the first real smile she had given Margaret since returning. "We are family, Mrs. Whitmore. Families forgive each other." And in that moment, Margaret finally understood what she had almost thrown away. Not just an employee, not just help, but a person who had become part of their family through love and dedication. A person who deserved respect and appreciation, not suspicion and fear. The road to change was still long, and there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in years, the Whitmore house felt like a real home again. A place where love was bigger than fear, where understanding could overcome prejudice, and where a little boy could have all the love and care he deserved from all the people who cherished him.